Okay, welcome to the heart vessel system lecture. We're looking at all of the vessels of the body, actually. The arteries, veins, capillaries, arterioles, venules, all these terms comprise the vessel system of the body. We last left off with the heart and its vessels, chambers, and valves. And now we're moving on to looking at all of the vessels in the body. And I like to start with the atrial system. So what is the atrial system? A for away. A for artery. A for blood going away from the heart. As we know, arteries carry oxygenated blood to all parts of the body through the systemic circuit. And the arterial system comprises three different types of arteries. And what I'd like you to do is to turn to page 483 in chapter 13 and begin with the blood vessels. And this material will go from page 483 to page 487 to discuss the arteries, veins, and capillaries. The arteries, again, are the sets of vessels that transport blood away from the heart to all parts of the body. And the three types of arteries that we have are the elastic, the muscular, and the arterioles. The elastic arteries emanate directly from the heart. The aorta is our main example. It's a thick-walled artery, 2.5 centimeters to 1 centimeter, and has a lot of elastic tissue. That is the reason it's called an elastic artery. And the elastic tissue, elastic means able to expand, like a rubber band. Elastic tissue means that it is able to conduct a large amount of blood with a lot of pressure. The aorta, as you see from the lab this week, has a large amount of blood going out of the heart and has a very thick and pullable wall, stretchable wall. And that is the main characteristic of the elastic arteries. The muscular arteries are more smooth muscle and less elastin, and they're less distensible. You know, you can't pull them as much, and they have more active, what we call lumen changes. In other words, the blood vessels get bigger and smaller due to the muscle in the vessel wall. We often don't think of muscles as being in vessels, but indeed they are. And the muscles in the vessel walls will cause vasoconstriction, vasodilation, to bring blood to the major organs and accommodate different amounts of fluids as needed. So, for example, if you're digesting and the stomach needs more blood going to it, the muscular arteries going to the stomach will get bigger and smaller as needed to accommodate the needs of that stomach. And then finally, we lead to something called the arterioles, a vessel that moves, as you can see from this diagram, from the artery to the capillary. In a way, these arterioles are very small and almost more like capillaries than arteries. If you take a look at figure 13.11, you can see it. The image is of the muscular arteries, the elastic arteries, and finally the arterioles being rather small. And because the size decreases so much, there is more resistance to blood flow as blood moves through the arteries and leads into the capillaries. And this is a picture of the tunica interna, which is a fancy word for inside layer of the vessels made of endothelium, right? Lining of the vessels, and the lumen being the open area of the vessel. That's a cross-section of vessels. And you can see that on figure 13.11. There's a tunica externa, which is an outside layer that's very thick and protects the vessel. Tunica interna that I just mentioned, made of endothelium, simple squamous, lining tissue, and then a tunica media. M for muscle, M for media. Tunica media has muscle, and that's the muscle of the vessels that vasoconstrict and vasodilate. Last but not least, again, is the capillaries. There are three types of capillaries, all right? Continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoidal. All of the capillaries, and we'll go over those in a moment, all of the capillaries are single, simple squamous, cell layer thick walls, okay? Single endothelial layer thick walls, and something known as parasites that are little muscle-like cells that stabilize the walls of the capillaries. If you were to take a cross-section of the lumen of a capillary, it's only 8 to 10 micrometers, enough for a red blood cell, maybe a bacteria, but not a whole cell. It's a small place, and its main function is diffusion. As you can see from the anatomy, it fits the physiology. The layer of the wall surrounding the capillary is a single layer thick. And if it's a single layer thick, that means you're able to diffuse stuff back and forth. So diffusion is the main function of the capillary because it has a thin endothelial layer. And what diffuses? In other words, what's exchanged? Nutrients, wastes, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. All these things are constantly exchanged. And let me just say, they have to be exchanged constantly in order to allow cells to live. You have to constantly get them oxygen, and you don't want to accumulate waste or they'll die. As we stated earlier, after 4 minutes, a cell dies without oxygen. So this is some serious stuff. And capillaries have to be able to bathe all parts of the body, all cells of the body, or else they will die. And I might say, what's more permeable, a brain or a liver capillary? The answer is liver. So one capillary does not fit all. One size does not fit all. Different capillaries for different regions. So that's why we're talking about here the different types of capillaries. Let's start with the continuous capillary. That means the wall is continuous. What surrounds the capillary is continuous. So if the blood vessel wall is continuous, what does that mean? It means it doesn't have a lot of holes, just a little bit. So it's very selective. It doesn't allow just anything in. The skin, the muscles, the BBB, that stands for blood-brain barrier. You can write that down, blood-brain barrier. And we'll put that in the chat room. BBB equals blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is the protection, I guess, that the brain has from infection and bad stuff getting in. Skin, you want continuous capillaries to prevent just anything from getting into your skin. And muscles as well. They're very expensive to build. Got to prevent things from getting in. So these are very well sealed and they have tight junctions. They do have little intercellular clefts that allow for movement through. So there is movement in and out of small stuff in these areas where there's continuous capillaries. Fenestration, the word to defenestrate means to throw out a window. I had a physics teacher that always said that to me. It's crazy. But fenestrations mean little holes or openings, oval pores. So fenestrated capillaries have open pores, and fenestrated capillaries, as you can see in figure 13.11, the picture of the fenestrated capillary shows little holes or open pores to allow filtration or absorption. The kidneys, the small intestines, areas where there's absorption of food or filtration to produce urine, you'll find a fenestrated capillaries. Sinusoidal means big open areas. A sinus is an open area, as you know from A&P1. The liver, the bone marrow, and the lymph have to have a lot of exchange. So in areas where there's a lot of exchange, the endothelium have big, large, what we say intercellular clefts. Very few tight junctions. In other words, large sinuses or open areas through which exchange can happen. And that is going to be your sinusoidal capillaries. Special Kupffer cells are present that are macrophages or protective immune cells in these areas because they're so open to the transport. I always think of sinusoidal capillaries as like Grand Central Station. Lots of stuff comes in, lots of stuff goes out. All of these capillaries converge to form venules, and venules are kind of a halfway bridge between a capillary and a vein. They're 800 to 100 micrometers in diameter, and they're formed when the capillaries unite. So veins, venules are very small veins accommodating deoxygenated blood. And they converge together to form the actual veins, all right? And as you know from this week's lab, there's a lot of types of veins, arteries, blood vessels, each having a different name. And the vein is named for whatever area it drains. So like if you're in the stomach and you're draining out, it's the gastric vein. If you're draining out the femoral area, it's the femoral vein. You know, often it's named for where it's draining. Not always, but often. What do? They drain. Basically, 65% of the blood supply as a blood reservoir at any one time is sitting inside of the vein system, the venal system, we'll call it. Veins have a large lumen and have a very low blood pressure going through, so therefore they don't need a thick wall, so there's thin walls. And the walls, the walls are thin and can be damaged easily. That's why when there's a deep vein thrombosis, as we talked about in another class, where there's a clot, it can cause valve damage in those veins where blood pools, and damage to the valves causes swelling in those areas. So the venous valves, all veins have what we call venous valves. In other words, valves that prevent blood flow. Why do you want to prevent backflow of blood in a vein? Well, there's not enough blood pressure to just push it through, so the veins kind of prevent the backflow. So it's a prevention of backflow of blood. And what is blood flow? It's defined as the volume of blood flowing through a vessel per milliliter, in milliliters per minute. And it's obviously, this is a common sense equation. The force of the blood flow is always dependent on the difference. Delta means difference. That triangle means delta, the difference in pressure from one area to another. So in other words, as you have a lot of pressure on one side and less pressure on another, blood's going to flow a lot quicker. A lot of pressure here, less pressure here, blood flows quickly. And that's the force determining blood pressure. What is blood pressure? The force exerted per unit on a vessel wall. And blood pressure always moves from a high to low amount, just like all fluids flow from a high to low pressure. And our blood pressure norms are 120 over 80 or less is normal. Okay, between 120 and 140 for the high number, that's prehypertensive, and 80 to 90 is prehypertensive. Some statistics show that 130 is the cutoff for prehypertensive. Anything above that is hypertensive. So again, below 120 over 80 is normal. You got to know that. Prehypertensive, 130 or 140 over 90. Anything between those two numbers, prehypertensive. Above that is just plain hypertensive, high blood pressure. What do these numbers mean? When you put a blood pressure cuff on, you basically restrict flow of blood to the rest of the arm. The cuff prevents any blood from flowing through, and then you ease up and allow blood to flow through. You listen right over here to the swishing of blood. As the heart overcomes the cuff, you will hear the first lub-dub, and swishing of the heart. That will give you your systolic number. That's your high number. The pressure at which the heart overcomes, all right? Pressure at which the heart overcomes the blood pressure cuff. When you last hear a swishing sound, that is the diastolic number. That's the low number. That's when everything is just moving as normal. That indicates when the ventricles are filling. The upper number indicates when the ventricles are contracting. The pressure on the vessels when the ventricle is contracting, that is the systolic number. The diastolic number gives you ventricles filling, pressure on the vessels when ventricles are filling. The table 13.1 gives you the norms for hypertension and pre-hypertension and normal blood pressure. Okay. Let's discuss ways in which, or the physics behind maintaining low blood pressure and how blood pressure rises and falls. Let's start with the physics of resistance. As blood encounters friction, you know what friction is? Move your keys, kind of push your keys along a table, and they're going to eventually stop flowing, right? Unless you grease it, then it'll flow further. You say there's less friction. Friction is the force acting in opposition to the blood flow. And that force, that friction, is bad for the heart because it causes the heart to have to work harder. Blood viscosity, vessel length, and vessel diameter all affect resistance. Blood viscosity, if you have thick blood, a lot of red blood cells, there's more resistance and less blood flow. That is a certain type of disorder. Vessel length. As you have more vessel length, more vessel in your body, there's more resistance because there's more wall that basically resists the blood going through. And therefore there's lesser flow of blood. So more vessel length leads to more friction and the heart has to work harder. That's why when you gain 1 pound of fat, there's 1,000 feet of blood vessels formed in that area. And therefore the heart has to overcome that increased vessel length. That is a reason why weight gain is associated with high blood pressure. Vessel diameter is another physics property associated with friction. As the diameter goes up, right, as you put a vessel bigger, it allows more blood to go through, less wall per unit area of blood, and therefore more blood flows through. So vasodilation, or making the blood vessels bigger, some drugs will make blood vessels bigger. That allows for less resistance. Heart has to work less hard. That's blood pressure. We say that the respiratory pump and the muscular pump help out the heart. What does that mean? Take a deep breath in. You are increasing your abdominal pressure and pushing more blood around the heart, moving blood further, and making the heart work a lot less. Deep breaths help the heart work less. That is known as your respiratory pump. Your muscular pump, stand up and kind of move your legs, do what we call pumps of the legs. In other words, stand on your toes. That is the muscular pump because you are making the skeletal muscles contract. And if the skeletal muscles contract, you've got blood pushing through, in figure 13.13, blood pushing through the chambers of the leg vessels. Therefore, the heart doesn't have to work as hard, right? As your muscles contract, the whole point behind exercise, keep your blood flowing as your muscles contract and push blood through the veins back to the heart. Heart doesn't have to work as hard, right? Low blood pressure is related to a longer lifespan. Resistance against the heart is bad. And blood pressure, as we talked about in the last lecture, higher blood pressure causes the blood to work harder. Resistance happens to be, as you can see here from this equation, that means directly proportional. The little fish means directly proportional. Resistance is directly proportional to 1 over the radius to the 4th power, the radius of the vessel to the 4th power. So that's a huge number. As you decrease the radius of the vessel, right? Let's say you go from 2 to 1, you make, as you decrease the radius of the vessel, you make the resistance much, much bigger. As you increase the radius, you vasodilate, right? You go from 2 to 3. 2 to the 4th power is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 16. 3 to the 4th power is 3 times 3 is 9, times 3, 27, 27 times 3, 81. 1/81th. So I don't want to confuse you with numbers here. I just want to say that as you increase the radius of the vessel, as you vasodilate, you decrease the resistance so dramatically according to this equation. So this last thing, vessel diameter, really affects resistance a great amount, right? I think we realize that. And, resistance and changing of vessels, you can think about it. When I was a small child, I used to wait every day on the subway. You know, we were about a block away from the subway, 2 blocks away from the subway. I'd wait for an old lady that always, in the 70s, they wore poofy dresses, people dressed up nice, and beehive haircut. I always waited for this lady, and my job at age 5 was, to water the lawn, in Queens, New York, just about a foot wide, and would water. And the old lady, I sprayed her once. She was pissed off. So then she started walking across the street, and I couldn't quite reach her with the hose. What a nasty kid. So I took the hose nozzle off, put my finger on top of the hose, and sprayed her across the street. Let me tell you something. That lady ran into the house. I ran up the stairs into our building, and she came right into the house. I ran under the bed, and I got a spanking from her. In the 70s, you could spank other kids, other people's kids. It was a different world, in some ways better, some ways worse. My mother gave her permission. Bad little boy spraying strangers. But I understood. So anyway, a little tale. I understood that if you change the vessel diameter of the hose, right? You put your finger on top of the hose, it sprays faster, it sprays further. And so there are changes, obviously, to resistance and to blood flow when you change the vessel diameter. That is one of the main reasons why people get heart attacks. Take a look at this clogged artery on the overhead here. These are fat pads. The fat pads change the vessel diameter, and blood becomes turbulent, as you can see going through. And a clogged artery, let's be honest, is going to happen when the blood gets turbulent. Turbulence occurs in clogged arteries due to an abrupt change in resistance. The resistance changes when the diameter changes, and that causes the platelets or clotting factors to come out and cause a clot, leading to a heart attack. So that is why clogged arteries are bad, and they happen as we get older. It's just natural. Low fat diet, exercise, all ways to fight it, but that is the big limiting factor for people. These clogged arteries can initiate clots. So that's dangerous. So let's talk about blood pressure overall. How do we control it? Number one, we call it baroreceptors. There are little receptors in the neck, in the carotid sinuses of the neck, that's aortic arch, upper body arteries, various places. These are receptors that detect pressure. I repeat, baroreceptors are receptors in these areas that detect pressure, and when they are stretched, they send an electrical impulse to the medulla, and they get stretched saying, hey, the blood pressure is too big, and the medulla, or the vasomotor center, sends out messages to vasodilate and decrease the blood pressure and make the blood vessels wider. Sometimes as you get up, you have less pressure on the receptor, and therefore there's less impulses, right? So there's vasoconstriction naturally. When I get up right now, there's less pressure up here because, you get up, the force of gravity keeps things down, less pressure. So immediately baroreceptors are less stretched, send that impulse to the medulla, and vasoconstrict you. So that's the physiology. Other things will cause changes in pressure. Chemical control. Increasing CO2. As you know, CO2 is an acid in the blood, and that decreases your pH, and that causes vasoconstriction. All you have to do is hold your breath, and you will, after 30 seconds, start getting higher blood pressure. Hold your breath, heart rate goes up. That is a direct control of blood pressure. That is so that you get more blood, needed blood to different parts of the body to allow for nutrients to get where they need to go. All right, the body's panicking a little bit because you're not getting oxygen. Next thing is hormones, the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands give off adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, same thing, same term. And that vasoconstricts. If you vasoconstrict, you increase the pressure, like we said. Nicotine, caffeine mimics adrenaline and increases blood pressure. Then we have something known as secondary hypertension. Hypertension, only 10% of cases are due to secondary hypertension. 90% of cases of hypertension or high blood pressure are unknown. Diet, exercise, genetics, but sometimes, like I said, 10% of the time we have secondary hypertension. That means something is going on with the kidney to cause the high blood pressure. Kidney regulates blood pressure by changing the blood volume. And when there's less blood volume, it decreases your blood pressure. Alcohol tends to immediately decrease blood volume. So you urinate out more, as we said in the last classes, you urinate out more and it decreases blood pressure. But because alcohol messes with the blood vessels, it causes actually a long-term increase in blood pressure. People who drink, excessive alcohol tend to have high blood pressure because you've been messing with the muscular arteries, vasodilating, vasoconstricting, and for other reasons. The endothelium and nitric oxide are two chemicals that vasoconstrict and vasodilate. Endothelin is a chemical made by the actual blood vessel itself that detects its own blood vessel pressure and causes vasoconstriction. The increase in blood pressure that happens is a response to low blood pressure. So you have a nice negative feedback going on with endothelin. Nitric oxide increases vasodilation. So more vasodilation decreases the blood pressure. So these two act antagonistically to each other. There's a principle known as the law of continuity that says that the greater the cross-sectional area of the vessel, the slower the velocity of blood. In other words, velocity of blood is equal to 1 over the cross-sectional area of the vessels. So they're inversely related. Let's take a look. An aorta tends to have blood flow 40 to 50 centimeters per second. The veins 10 to 30 centimeters per second. But the capillaries, you would think they're very small and that they would have a rapid blood flow based on that principle, but they don't. 0.03 centimeters per second. So the slowest blood is in the capillaries, and that's because the largest cross-sectional area of all the vessels is called the capillary bed. So you got to add up all the individual capillaries to determine the cross-sectional area. So blood flows slowest through the capillaries, then the veins, and fastest in the aorta and the arteries. And that makes common sense that, you want blood that has oxygen to get quickly to the parts that need it, the body parts, and who cares how slowly it goes back. I mean, you got to have blood flowing back, but it's not as serious. So the body is made in such a way that blood gets to where it needs to go and on the way back a bit slower. Slowest in the capillaries because that's where exchange needs to happen. And you need blood to flow slowly for diffusion and exchange to properly take place. So it makes good sense. And it's good business for the capillaries to be completely the slowest and quite a bit slower, 0.03 instead of 40, centimeters per second, to allow exchange of all the materials. So how do we regulate blood flow? Blood volume and blood pressure. There's something known as the direct renal mechanism and then the indirect renal mechanism. Let me go over that. Blood pressure is controlled by both mechanisms. Direct renal mechanism, let me tell you in simple language. You have more blood pressure, you got to pee more, and it removes the blood. It removes water from the blood through the urine and therefore reduces pressure. Let me repeat. The direct renal mechanism means that as you have a higher blood volume, you will have more filtration in the glomerulus of the kidney. That's the filtering part of the kidney. And therefore, if there's more filtration, there's less blood volume. More is getting filtered out, you're peeing out more. And so directly, when you have increased blood pressure, you directly pee out more volume of blood, and that decreases the blood pressure. Does that make sense? It decreases the blood pressure because you're getting less water in the blood itself. The indirect renal mechanism uses 3 types of hormones: angiotensin II, aldosterone, and antidiuretic hormone known as ADH to raise your blood pressure. All right. When the kidneys detect low blood pressure, they release renin, a strange enzyme / hormone creature that stimulates angiotensin 2, which, by the way, the coronavirus likes to attach to receptors of angiotensin 2. But angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction and raises the blood pressure. Also, this stimulates the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex gives out aldosterone and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which both increase blood pressure. Aldosterone increases it by reabsorbing sodium. ADH causes reabsorption of water. All three, and I wish one of the teachers I had would have told me this, all three of those hormones raise blood pressure. Different mechanisms, but raise blood pressure. Don't forget about the respiratory and muscular pump. These are very important, exercise and breathing, to get the blood flowing and reduce strain on the heart and blood pressure. Last but not least, I want you to know these terms about the blood vessel system. One, an aneurysm. This is a picture of an aneurysm. That is a ballooning out of a vessel. Here's a vessel. In this case, there's a clot that forms to protect against the aneurysm, which in a way makes it worse. The aneurysm is always a ballooning out of a vessel. Many people are walking around with an aneurysm and it's not causing any trouble. But once it bursts, that's the problem. A clot forms and nothing's getting through. And you can even bleed to death and not have the blood flow like it should. Stroke is very known for this. The aortic aneurysm is very known for this. The abdominal aorta can have aneurysms. So often the aorta or some brain vessels are known for aneurysms. Can happen anywhere in the body, but those are areas usually an artery. Let's talk about hypotension. Anytime the high number is less than 100, people feel dizzy, confused, and tired. Orthostatic hypotension refers to standing up and getting dizzy and confused and tired. And that's often associated with older people because they stand up and then they don't, the baroreceptor reflex that we talked about takes too long to work. You know, as you're older, things go slower. And so the baroreceptor takes too long to work and the person gets dizzy, and that's because that mechanism doesn't raise the blood pressure fast enough. So the treatment, you know, the person should sit first, drink a little water, and then get up slowly. That's the treatment. Last but not least, phlebitis is an inflammation of a blood vessel, and deep vein thrombosis is a clot in an unbroken vessel, usually in the back of the leg, popliteal area, and or you know, maybe usually popliteal, that area, maybe femoral, but the back of the leg, often the lower leg. Deep vein thrombosis happens often in elderly or in people. It's associated with birth control pills. It's also associated with sitting too long on a plane. You're sitting too long, blood pools. Anytime blood pools, that can initiate clotting. That's why I always say, you know, even after an operation, they want you to get up, walk, move around, prevent clots. So a phlebitis is an inflammation of a vessel. That's a different story. And that can be superficial and painful, and either antibiotics or just time will resolve it. Last but not least is varicose veins. That's a ballooning out of veins, pooling of blood, and an extension of the vein. So in other words, an extending of the veins that bulge out, a bulging of the veins. Now, I once said that it's only cosmetic, it's not painful, and a student went crazy because they had it and they said absolutely not the case. Often it's cosmetic, but very much related to teachers, nurses, people who stand a lot, and pregnancy. The veins have a lot of pooling, and the pooling continues more with women than men. And, you know, there are surgeries, cosmetic surgeries to remove them, but that is varicosity of the veins, right? Okay, that concludes our blood vessel lecture. Thank you for your attention. Any questions, feel free to email.